Low insulin, no fat storage, burns body fat, expels body fat. Dr. Ben Bikman.
Now let's flip it around. Those studies looked at lowering insulin. What happens if we increase insulin? So this study took equal body weight groups, type 2 diabetics, body weight matched with non-diabetics. And that in the original state, the metabolic rate in the type 2 diabetics was higher than the non-diabetics. And that might be for any number of reasons, but least of which could be that their insulin might have been lower than the other overweight non-diabetic. But what happens when you start the type 2 diabetic on insulin therapy? Their metabolic rate starts to significantly drop, and that's what they found. When the type 2 diabetics started insulin therapy, metabolic rate dropped. More evidence that there's some shift going on.
What happens when we increase insulin? In type 2 diabetics, this study showed the insulin group, their metabolic rate decreased.
And then the last study I want to show you, just as hints that are supporting this overall effect in humans, is this one, and I love this study. So let's just look at it. Don't let it be daunting at first glance. This took type 2 diabetics from month 0 when they were first beginning their insulin therapy. And so let's look at a few key things on this slide. So what's happening to their insulin dose over this 6 months? Do you see what's happening? The overall trend, their insulin dose is climbing. And that's very much reflective of this biological phenomenon that too much of something results in a desensitizing or a downregulation of the sensitivity to that something. In other words, hyperinsulinemia causing insulin resistance. So these type 2 diabetics are becoming more and more insulin resistant throughout the course, in just 6 months, mind you. Now what's happening to their body weight throughout the course? This is only 6 months, and they gain about 20 pounds of fat, and that's actually quite common among type 2 diabetics who begin insulin therapy. So a 20-pound gain. Now lastly, that's interesting so far, but what happens to the amount of food they're eating, or at least reporting? It's going down. So one of these variables, insulin dose or caloric consumption, is matching the overall change in body weight.
In another study of type 2 diabetics, starting from month 0, the beginning of their insulin therapy, the results, over time, insulin dose increased, body weight increased, while their caloric intake decreased.
Again, there are two theories of why we get fat, the caloric and the endocrine theory. And very much among both of them, there's this insistence that energy must be stored or used. But in the case of the endocrine theory, which encompasses both of those, there's also that third option that we have to consider, which is energy can be wasted. Not wasted in a universal context, but in the human context, wasted from our bodies. And in the state where insulin is low, evidence I showed you suggests that we have a shift in how our fat tissue is acting. In particular, fat tissue is acting more uncoupled. It's acting more like brown adipose tissue, and there's relatively less overall activity of the white adipose tissue. And then the takeaway from that is, if there's less of adipose tissues acting less like white adipose tissue, then we're less inclined to store it. So there's a reduced inclination to store energy. And in contrast, because of the shift in fat tissue acting more uncoupled or more like brown fat tissue, there's an increase in the usage. But it's not because we're working more. This doesn't mean we're exercising more, because what are we using that energy for? It was for heat, yeah. So that's the thermoregulation aspect of brown fat. And then lastly, again, but separate from these previous two, separate from brown fat, I just had to mention it, with insulin is low, ketogenesis is up, and now we have these little pieces of nutrients that we are wasting from the body in the form of expired breath and urination. So altogether, these overall factors is what leads me to fairly comfortably conclude that the caloric theory is very much encompassed within the endocrine theory.
Dr. Bikman's conclusion: the caloric model of weight loss is unproven and limited. The endocrine model shows that reduced insulin from low-carb eating stops fat storage, uses energy as heat, it burns body fat, it wastes energy, expels body fat in the breath and in urination.
Annotated and summarized, easy to share with loved ones. The description below the title for this video has these summary points.
What happens when we increase insulin? In type 2 diabetics, this study showed the insulin group, their metabolic rate decreased. As insulin was given more and more, they became more insulin resistant. In another study of type 2 diabetics, starting from month 0, the beginning of their insulin therapy, the results, over time, insulin dose increased, body weight increased, while their caloric intake decreased. Dr. Bikman's conclusion: the caloric model of weight loss is unproven and limited. The endocrine model shows that reduced insulin from low-carb eating stops fat storage, uses energy as heat, it burns body fat. It wastes energy, expels body fat in the breath and in urination.